This is Meredith for Real, the Curious Introvert, and I'm Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. Each high contrast guest gives you the layered deep dive that you crave, not just the Google results making headlines. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Each episode is different, so bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. This episode is for all you history nerds out there who also enjoy your fair share of the spooky. My guest shares all kinds of examples of near-death experiences from ancient history that are head-scratchingly similar, like how Native American NDEs have similar elements to the ones in ancient Greece. Like, how did that even happen? He also addresses many of the skepticisms that we have around NDEs, like, could the commonalities of NDEs just be a psychological reflection of the human desire to be remembered, or neurons from a dying brain? We also got into universal consciousness and reincarnation. So, basically, this is everything you wished your history class in high school was, but it wasn't. And I want to let you know, if you are a repeat curiositor, thank you. This is your official invite to my private Facebook group. In there, I post content that I don't share anywhere else. I invite you to shape future episodes, and I do occasional giveaways. You can search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes. I hope to see you in there. And if you end up liking this episode, you'll also like the one I did with the atheist doctor who studied near-death experiences for 50 years. You will hear him mentioned a couple of times in this episode. That is episode 224. Or if you ever watch podcasts on YouTube, you can find me there. And there's a whole playlist called PSI, and that one you'll really enjoy. All right, friends, keep it curious. Near-death experiences aren't something you hear about every day, but they may be more common than you realize. So common, in fact, that people throughout time and history, and even separated by geography, had similar near-death experiences. But how could that be? What does it mean? How do we know it? And why does it even matter? That's what we're unpacking with my next guest. What began as a degree in Egyptian archaeology has led him to become the leading authority on near-death experiences and afterlife beliefs across cultures throughout history. Today, we're going to discuss culture versus consciousness as we ask the question, how is it possible that NDEs everywhere are so similar? Scholar, author, fellow introvert, Dr. Gregory Shushan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Meredith. Thanks very much. And yeah, thanks for flagging that introvert thing.
Yeah, I think being an introvert is an interesting asset to research, don't you think? Because you really get energized by thinking those deeper questions.
Yeah. And just like the thought of collaborative project, or just like, what? No.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the biggest ick.
Yeah, and it's the focus and concentration that you can only get while you're just doing something on your own, alone, exactly how you want to do it. That's, I think, facilitates this kind of research quite a lot.
Oh, interesting. I never actually attributed that to introversion, but I 100% have that quality.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. Well, I really enjoyed researching your book and this topic in preparation for our discussion, and I learned so much. But I think it might be fair for us and for everyone to ask the question, with so much going on in this known reality, why does studying NDEs even matter?
It matters I think, from quite a few perspectives. One is that we're all going to die, regardless of what reality we're going through.
Okay, yeah, that's a good reason.
It's the great leveler, no matter if you're a billionaire or if you're living on the streets, we're all going to end up in the same state of consciousness prior to death. And then who knows what's going to happen after that. But, there are these people throughout history and around the world who have had these glimpses, apparently, of what happens to your consciousness during the dying process, and then some glimpses of what happens after you die. So I think we can learn that as far as, what that experience is going to be like. But it also matters for, near-death studies, the kind of work I'm doing, looking at the cross-cultural differences as well as the similarities. It matters for the history of religions, which is the field that I'm from. I'm not a near-death researcher like people like Bruce Grayson or Kenneth Ring or Jan Holden. I come from, as you mentioned, Egyptian archaeology and the humanities and the study of religions. So this subject has been ignored in that field almost entirely. So I'm trying to kind of do a course correction because it's really about the history of our consciousness in relation to life after death and the history of why and how we believe in an afterlife.
How do you know that these were physical experiences and not just like a Christmas Carol type tale to encourage moral behavior?
Yeah, great question. Well, it depends on which kind of society that I was looking at. But for the most part, for the ancient civilizations, what I did is actually back up to the very beginning. So when I was doing the Egyptian archaeology work, we were reading hieroglyphs, or learning hieroglyphs and reading the ancient literature in the original languages. And I started noticing as I was reading things like the pyramid texts and books of the dead, the descriptions of the afterlife journey were very much like a near-death experience. So the soul leaves the body, enters darkness, comes out into a realm of light, meets ancestors, meets a being of light, who in this case was the sun god Re, has even an encounter with their own corpse. So that idea in near-death experiences where people will see their body from a vantage point outside of it, and that makes them realize, okay, I've survived my death because I'm seeing myself, yet I'm still alive, I'm still conscious, but that body's dead. So that's the kind of realization of survival of death. That was kind of symbolically evident in the text. So anyway, as I kind of came to that realization, I thought, how can I test that idea that Egyptian afterlife beliefs were related to near-death experiences? Because there are no actual accounts of near-death experience from ancient Egypt. Writing was used for very specific kind of formal purposes. It wasn't like, oh, dear diary, I died and left my body today. So I decided to expand and do a comparative study of afterlife beliefs in the world's earliest civilization. So it's the earliest religious texts basically across the world, in Egypt, pre-Buddhist China, ancient Sumer, ancient India, sort of before proper Hinduism, and then the Maya and the Aztec from Mesoamerica. So what I didn't expect to find were accounts of actual near-death experiences in all of these different societies, except for Egypt. I was just going to look at the afterlife beliefs, in relation to the descriptions of NDEs. But the more I dug, the more I found, these are experiences that are expressed in very different ways from the religious guidebooks to the afterlife, like the Egyptian example. And what I mean by that is they happen to historical individuals who we know actually lived. There's historical evidence for them. It gives the context of their death and return to life. So it'll say so-and-so was lying on their deathbed or whatever happened to them. They were killed in battle, and then they came back to life and they told us that this is what happened. So all that was a long-winded way of basically saying it's the context for me that determines whether an account is a near-death experience or not. If it seems to have been believed as such in the civilization that I'm looking at, then I kind of have no choice but to look at it from their perspective, because we don't have any way of testing whether the person was really dead or whether they were, really a genuine person. In a lot of cases, even if it's like an NDE and they present it as a documentary account, we're still not 100% sure if that person really existed in some of these accounts.
That's why I found the example. Oh, you're going to have to help me. It was an ethnographer in Mexico who,
right.
Yeah, talk to me about that one, because that one I found very interesting. And until it got captured for Catholic Agenda, I thought, wow, that's really compelling. Share that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, and in fact, even the way it was manipulated by Catholic Agenda is also interesting in its own way, because it shows the way near-death experience, this shows the kind of religious power behind them. But I'll get to that. So yeah, basically, this is an account reported by a Spanish missionary named Bernardino de Sahagún in 1541, 1521, something like that. I don't remember the exact date. But Sahagún was interesting as a Spanish missionary because he wasn't all fire and brimstone. He wasn't like, tie him to the stake and burn him immediately kind of guy. He really wanted to learn what the actual religions were like, and he wanted to preserve the ancient beliefs. So he talked to priests and elders and shamans, the kind of keepers of the culture of the ancient Aztec civilization. He learned the language and everything. So he was really pretty extraordinary for his time and for his context. There wasn't really such a thing as anthropology and ethnography at the time. So this account seems to be pretty legit because of all that. And also because it involves people who we, again, knew that they existed. They're historical figures. So there was a ruler called Mohiquish, and he had a daughter-in-law named Quetzalcoatl. And for some reason that's not explained in the text, unfortunately, he kills her, or he injures her in a way that eventually leads to her dying. And so she's buried, her funeral is prepared and everything. There's no question about her death in the minds of the people surrounding her. In fact, Her family actually said, we want her to be buried, but not cremated. So they had some kind of premonition that something was not right about this situation, and they wanted to make sure that she wasn't cremated. So it comes back to life, and she says how she was met by a sickly youth, as she describes him, and that he led her on this kind of tour of the other world. She met the Aztec god of the underworld who's associated with spring and rebirth and renewal. His name was Tlaloc. She saw her deceased son or son-in-law, stepson, in this experience, and she saw him in a kind of renewed state, in a healthy state, and she was told that he's going to be reborn and he's going to have a fulfilled life in his next birth. She was also given a premonition, or a prophecy rather, about the coming of the Spaniards. So this was, even though Sahagún is a Spaniard and he's relating it, it happened some years before the Spaniards actually got there. So unfortunately, the last page of this account is missing, so we don't know exactly what happens with her return to life. But there are other examples of a woman who dies and comes back to life. And it's not clear if it's the same story retold or if it's a different one. But in these versions, they describe a very dramatic situation where she bursts forth from her grave and all the stones that were piled on it go flying everywhere, and really kind of dramatic storytelling elements. So up to this point, it's a historical account from the indigenous perspective. But then gradually, as the decades and centuries roll on and the Spaniards retell this myth, they start putting like a very Christian missionary kind of agenda sheen on it. So at first they changed her name to Papan. I guess for some reason they thought that was less indigenous sounding than Quetzalcoatl. And they say she's met by a shining being who has wings, described like an angel. And he takes her on a tour of the other world in a way that's more similar to like European accounts like Dante or whatever, some of these medieval otherworld journey accounts. And then as the decades roll on, by the 18th century, she's practically a saint. And they say that, they full on call the figure that meets her an angel. He has a cross on his head, and he tells her that she needs to go back and preach Christianity to her people and tell them about baptism. And she becomes known within the Catholic Church as this kind of, saint-like baptizer of the indigenous people. And that's the version that's accepted by the Catholic Church to this day as literal truth. They don't accept the original version, which is, it's pretty interesting.
It is interesting. And I think that's part of the stickiness with near-death experiences is I think there's like a human thing in us, right? To want to take something that happens to us and, sprinkle a little magic in it. And so, or sprinkle a little agenda in it. And we don't think of it as an agenda, certainly. Some might, but like that is the fallibility of these sorts of experiences. But what I find so additionally intriguing, because that's probably my favorite story out of the cases that you highlighted in the book, I find it really intriguing the similarities of the elements, especially the ones that are super specific across time and across culture. Because time we can kind of justify, okay, this person's great-great-great-granddaddy told them about a yellow dog that will guide them to the afterlife. But when you separate cultures, it becomes more of a head scratcher. Do you have any specifics that stand out for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing there. I mentioned that I kind of determine whether an account is an NDE by the context. And I mean that rather than the content. I don't say, okay, did they leave their body? Did they meet a deceased relative? Did they meet a being of light? Like whatever they happen to say, I accept it as an NDE. But having said that, they always do feature at least some of those particular traditional elements. And, with the account of Quetzalcoatl, just the very fact that the Catholic missionaries were able to see this sickly, deformed youth that met her and think, no, that's an angel, and kind of interpret it in their own cultural way and project their own meaning onto it. That in itself, I think, is pretty interesting because it shows a cross-cultural or at least universal kind of identification of this figure. And then another kind of just general example is when people see a being of light, even in contemporary examples, a lot of times they'll come back from their ND and they'll say, I saw Jesus. And the researcher will say, okay, describe Jesus. And it's not like, oh, he had his crown of thorns and wearing a robe, or he was on a crucifix or whatever. It's, oh, he was just radiating light, but I knew it was Jesus. And that's the same with Buddhists or Hindus, seeing Krishna, or Muslims seeing Muhammad or whatever. So whether this being of light is like an objective being of light and people like projecting their cultural imagery on it, or whether they really are seeing these different entities is an interesting question. But it goes way back to the being of light is one of the most common cross-cultural accounts. Probably the earliest historical example of an NDE, the earliest one I found anyway, is to an ancient Sumerian king named Bilgamesh, and he's more popularly known as Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is going back to about 1800 BCE, and the text describes how he's lying on his deathbed. His soul leaves his body and travels to the other world, and he meets a being of light. In this case, it's the sun god, Utu, who's radiating light, and he's then kind of assists in this process of a life review, which is exactly what beings of light do in contemporary near-death experiences. People will come back and say, I had this panoramic vision of or experience of all of my memories happening at once, and it was, helped but not judged by this being of light. But in the Sumerian example, there is like a panel of judges, and they're all radiating light. And they decide that Bilgamesh had a favorable life. He built temples and he was a good ruler and he conducted the rituals in a traditional way. So very much a Sumerian example of the ideal of good behavior. And then he meets some deceased relatives and there's a party thrown in his favor, a big, large banquet. And then he's sent back to his body and he's then at that point able to kind of prepare his funeral and he dies shortly thereafter. So I like that account because, again, it's a figure who we know really existed. There really was this ancient Sumerian king. It's close to 4,000 years old. It's way on the other side of the world. Sumerian was actually a linguistic isolate language, which means it's not connected to any known language in the world. So the idea that, it could have passed on to the Aztecs, 3,000 how many ever years later to influence the account of Quetzalcoatl, that just did not happen. And in fact, the basis upon which I chose these civilizations was that they didn't have that kind of cultural contact between them. So that kind of automatically rules out that these myths traveled all around the world.
Because that is usually the question, right? That's usually the comeback, the objection is, well, especially Egypt was such a central place of trade. So you imagine people chatting with each other and intermarrying with each other. But in the case that you just said, why does that sound so similar to more modern NDEs? Yeah, I also found it interesting. Maybe it was not an NDE, but there was religious iconography you'll have to correct me because I'm probably not going to get this right from my memory, but it was like an Egyptian or not, maybe it was like a North African culture that was resistant to outside influence. And they had two gods that were the same as somewhere else. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, yeah, it was Egypt. It was I think in the pyramid texts, or the coffin texts were a little bit later than the pyramid texts. And both of these texts are the precursors to the Book of the Dead, the one that everybody knows about. So yeah, there are a couple of appearances of these kind of minor gods from an area called Byblos in the ancient world, the ancient Mediterranean, ancient Near East. And their presence there definitely does show that there was some kind of cultural influence or trade going on, but it really seems to be limited to those two gods, which is interesting. I'm not sure why, because those texts are so filled with many, many, many gods that the Egyptians had of their own. And in fact, there's examples where they're talking about the soul of the dead, and the soul becomes divinized, and they're associated with Osiris, the god of the dead, and with Re, the sun god. And they will then say, like, his hand is the god Sia, his upper arm is the god, or whoever it is. And so every part of the body is associated with a different god. So they definitely weren't lacking for their own gods. And why those two happened to creep in, I don't know. It might have just been that particular scribe, because I don't think they're mentioned in the later Egyptian afterlife guidebooks.
What are some other elements that are similar across cultures? I mentioned the yellow dog earlier because I kept seeing the dog thing come up. Are there others?
The dog is a good example because that does seem to be an element in historical cross-cultural NDEs, but it's not really an element in contemporary ones. So that's a really great example of differences and similarities at the same time. And I think the reason for the dog motif to begin with is that, dogs, even in the ancient world, could be guides, just like they are now, guide dogs. And they're also guardians, they're protectors. So they kind of serve to protect the soul of the dead from any kind of threats. So yeah, they serve this function. It's interesting that in contemporary examples, doesn't really seem to be a need for a guardian that protects you on the otherworld journey. That might be because those earlier texts were elaborated upon more, and it's more of the beliefs rather than the core of the experience. I think that's probably what's going on. But yeah, the most cross-cultural elements really are, there's kind of 9 that I isolated, which are leaving the body, going to another world, entering darkness, a realm of light, a being of light, some kind of transformation or unification with the divine, meeting deceased relatives, and coming back to the body. I think that's 9.
And there was also something with food that we don't have today, like they couldn't eat it or something.
Yeah. That's an interesting one because there are a lot of, especially Native American examples, a couple of Polynesian ones where the idea of eating food in the other world is seen as taboo, and that if you eat the food, then you won't be able to come back from your near-death experience. What's super interesting about that is that idea happens in ancient Greece. There's the myth of Persephone and Hades, where it's the exact same thing. If you eat food, in the case of Persephone, a pomegranate seed, she's not going to be able to return from the underworld. And so there's, just to give one example, the Sioux people, from 1849, there was a man named Male Elk, and he died and revived on his funeral scaffold because they would put the corpses like hanging on a scaffold. So they're very careful to explain these details to emphasize that this was a real case and that he really was dead. So they're concerned that it's a historical example and that happened to a real people. So he comes back and he says his soul traveled along the path of braves, the warrior Indians who went to the other world. He went through a land of idyllic natural beauty, and then he swam across a river to a village of his ancestors' spirits. So he's meeting his deceased relatives, and there he meets his uncle. And it's his uncle who tells him, don't eat anything while you're here, because if you do, you're not going to be able to return to Earth. And then his return isn't described, but he obviously did, or he wouldn't have been able to tell that story. And yeah, there's quite a few examples like that. And another one that's just incredibly specific, but doesn't happen really in contemporary NDEs, is the idea that there are rocks that clash together repeatedly, and the soul has to kind of slip through those rocks before they're squished between these rocks. That's an ancient Greek myth, and it happens in Native American examples.
Wow, that's so crazy. Greek and Native American, like that to me is why this is so interesting.
Yeah, and the fact that they share that and the not eating food thing, but absolutely no possibility of Greek myth entering Native American thought. I mean, the only way would be like early explorers and missionaries, and in some cases ethnographers, teaching Greek myths to Native Americans, and then them claiming that somebody had an NDE and had these. And I think that's really, really unlikely.
Yeah, because you wouldn't be a very good ethnographer if you were like, hey, guys, gather around. Let me tell you something.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and there's not really any benefit to teaching them Greek myth when you're trying to convert them to Christianity.
Oh,
and,
yeah, that too.
Dominate their culture. So
Excellent point.
Yeah. And those are examples. I don't know how to explain that at all. I mean, if they were elements of a near-death experience in contemporary accounts and cross-culturally beyond Greece and Native American and a few Polynesian, if they were happening in China and everywhere else, that would make sense. But the only thing I can think of is that certain kinds of cultures, certain types of individuals have similar ways of storytelling, and they come up with similar plot devices and plot elements, convey different kinds of teachings about what's going on in the other world. And we see that with lots of accounts of NDEs. They are elaborated upon over time. A lot of them, are just totally unbelievable when we read them from a perspective of knowledge of contemporary NDEs. In fact, a good example of that is the myth of from ancient Greece. It's like the earliest example of an ancient Greek NDE, and it was recounted by Plato. And it starts out very much like an NDE. He says, was this particular soldier, and he mentions who his father was and where he came from, and takes care to present it in a way that's intended to show this is a real person, and this is a story that's intended to be believed. He even says this is not going to be like the journey of Odysseus to the underworld, meaning like you're supposed to believe this one, that one was just a myth.
He was setting your expectation like early on. This is boring, but it's real.
Yeah. And he says, how many days was dead. He died on this particular battlefield. His family came and got his corpse and brought it home. So the whole setup is an NDE. And then some of the content is very much like an NDE because he left his body and the deceased relatives and the visions of the other world. But then there's things about it that are For one thing, it's really long and elaborate. And there's just he sees like the workings of the universe in the form of what's called the wheel of necessity. And it's like literally seeing the mechanism of the cosmos and the way the planets interact and all the different layers of the planets. And just goes on and on with Plato. And well, it's actually, he puts the words in Socrates' mouth. So it's Socrates explaining Plato's vision of the workings of the universe. And he meets Odysseus and he meets all these figures from Greek mythology. So it's very obviously not just a pure NDE. It's not a verbatim NDE that talked about. Maybe he explained it at one point and then Plato ran with it, basically.
Well, that again speaks to like the human psychology and just the human nature. And you mentioned the storytelling aspect of it. So I kind of wonder, because when I was reading your book, there were several cultures that emphasized the terror of being forgotten. Dissolving into nothingness, I think is how you worded it in the book. And I wanted to ask you, could the commonalities of NDEs be from just a psychological reflection of the human desire just to be remembered?
No, I don't think so, because of those 9 similarities that I mentioned that just seem to be superimposed all around the world. I think that's just too many things that are too specific to be able to explain in terms of like one psychological concern. Like that one, another one that was popular since Freud, if not earlier, was basically afterlife beliefs are compensation for our fear of death or for disappointment in this life and for wanting to see justice in the next world. So yeah, maybe there's an element of that. I think there probably is, especially in the ways in which we believe in an afterlife and the way they kind of contribute to religious systems and the way we feel about these things. But as far as these descriptions, I don't see how one fear or one hope or one desire could lead to this complex of similarities around the world.
Oh, basically. I can only imagine the research challenge for you to separate the feelings from the accounts. So because in my mind, it's all like one big soup. But I want to move on to consciousness for a while. In your book, you talked about how the afterlife in Egyptian texts was a cosmic circuit, kind of a renewing interaction between life and death. And I think in other cultures, there's also this idea that heaven is an in-between place, not necessarily a static, eternal location. Hey, Curiositors, just a quick pause to show gratitude to our sponsors and give you some special deals. From time to time, I recommend other podcasts you might like, and here's one I know that you're going to love. It's the Jordan Harbinger Show. I love it because it's smart without being too highbrow and 1,000% ADD friendly. I know, you love it already. I'm a genuine true fan. When I have time to listen to podcasts just for pleasure, not, guest research, the Jordan Harbinger Show is my automatic choice. It's like when you're hungry and someone asks you what you want, and then before you even have a minute to think about it, you find yourself at Chick-fil-A because, obviously, Jordan's the Chick-fil-A of podcasts. Some of my favorites include the one with the man held hostage by Somali pirates, that's episode 115, and the pain psychologist about how pain lives in the brain, not in the body, episode 661. You can't go wrong with adding the Jordan Harbinger Show to your rotation. It's incredibly interesting and there's never a dull show. Search for the Jordan Harbinger Show, that's HARB as in boy, I, N as in Nancy, GER, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The Florida Panhandle isn't just the home of your favorite podcaster. That's me, by the way. Shameless, I know. But it's also a go-to spot for a lot of families on vacation. Don't plan a Pensacola trip without getting tickets to the UWF Historic Trust. It's good for a whole week, and it's a great indoor activity option. You'll recognize Trader John's where I record the show in the Pensacola Museum of History. Get your tickets in person so you can show the agent one of my emails and get $2 off an adult ticket. historicpensacola.org. Now back to the show. Remember to stay till the end where I give you a sneak peek of next week's episode. And so I wanted to ask you, I hope you don't mind, pretend we're on debate team in high school,
okay.
Right?
Oh, no.
You're on the debate team,
Okay.
but we're coming up on a competition. And you have to decide based on the sum of these accounts that you know as a researcher, would you be on the team for the static, eternal location of a heaven or a hell, or would you be on the team of a cyclical consciousness?
I would be on the a team that might sound like a cop-out, but I have good reasons for it. I'd be on the it depends team.
Of course.
Even just within the Egyptian example. So the soul of the dead leaves the body, travels to the other world, joins the sun god Re on what they call the cosmic boat or the sun bark, and it kind of sails into the sky and then down into the underworld. But what makes it complicated from the very beginning is it's not just that the soul of the dead is sailing with the sun god Re, the soul of the dead is the sun god Re at the same time. And then as it travels into the other world, and to see Osiris, the soul of the dead is also Osiris. And there's even a god named Osiris Re, which is the combination, the integration of the sun god and the underworld god, which is also the soul of the dead. To me, it's a transcendent experience that's not just a cyclical thing. It's not just arriving at a place. And then, an even more complicated additional layer, they talk about the soul dwelling in the field of marshes, which is kind of like a happy hunting grounds, or the field of offerings, where the soul benefits from all the offerings that are sent to them from earth, basically the essence of these food offerings and their weaponry and whatever else it is. And that's presented like an eternal state of being, this heavenly kind of realm. So how we're supposed to square that with the cyclical afterlife also being eternal, that's one of the challenges of Egyptology that Egyptologists have been grappling with for a couple hundred years. And some of the solutions that they come up with are things like, well, there was a northern tradition and a southern tradition, and they didn't integrate them properly. And it must mean that the scribes didn't quite know what they were talking about, so they just threw it all in there. I really don't think that's the case. I think we kind of need to accept that the people we're getting our material from knew what they were talking about, and that they were a little more sophisticated than people give them credit for sometimes.
Well, you're talking about...
I think it's our failure of understanding.
Yes, and our way of thinking, which leads me to the question of linear and nonlinear thought. Because you said in the book, we have to be careful to remember that even though I, the author, am telling you about these Egyptian texts in like a linear way because, it's in a book, you have to remember that's not exactly how the Egyptian texts were meant to be understood. And that got me thinking like, okay, well, what if our own reality is not linear? And I know that's a little like, woo, we're going out there. But isn't that what an NDE is all about, is nonlinear reality and taking serious the things that we can't see?
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of people who have NDEs, when they try to talk about them, it's very difficult for them to put it into a coherent sequence of events. And they feel like it all kind of happened at once. But there is a logic to, obviously, you left your body before you met your deceased relative in the other realm. So there's a sequence that makes sense that I think is maybe where the storytelling element first comes in, just in relating an ineffable experience, especially when they're trying to talk about things like, I was one with the divine. Well, if you're really one with the divine, how can you be separate enough to even talk about being one with the divine?
Right.
And that's another kind of, dichotomy that recurs constantly throughout these texts. Union with the divine, but at the same time separate from the divine.
Because that was clearly like let's dive headfirst into, nonlinear thought and the universe. But on the other side, it could be argued that, there's this idea that our thoughts and imaginations pool together in a kind of large database and recirculate over time. So how possible is it that the consistencies of NDEs across cultures and time are just a result of universal consciousness?
It's possible, but like a Jungian kind of standpoint, like a collective conscious archetype thing. But I guess my answer to that is really, again, why would they occur in this particular set? If the archetype was just a being of light and it didn't involve all these other elements of an NDE or just meeting your deceased relatives. The deceased relatives thing just seems like completely logical. Of course you would, because they died before I did. If that was the only thing that was cross-cultural, to me that would, either collective unconscious thing or a storytelling thing or whatever would make more sense. But the fact that it's this kind of consistent near-death experience set that's being superimposed, to me, that's more compelling. Because near-death experience, I should have mentioned this earlier, all this stuff I'm talking about has nothing to do with whether these are genuine metaphysical experiences or not. My arguments and the findings that I've come up with, they could be the case whether it's just all in the brain, it's just the dying brain shutting down, or whether it's a metaphysical thing. So which is something I like about it. It's something I've really tried to steer that middle path to make it as rigorous as possible, and makes that point that, this evidence can be used to support either of those perspectives, interpretations of NDEs.
And speaking of the perspective of the dying brain, I think that is for me, the most frequently mentioned argument that I've heard, because, this is a topic that comes up at dinner a lot because that's how I am. And so my friends and family will, rightly so, say, well, perhaps, the person's brain is dying, and this sort of experience that they're having is a result of their neurological pathways. So then in the case of NDEs over time and space, or I shouldn't use time and space because then we'll go back to the consciousness thing. Time and geography, could it be because we all as humans have a similar physical brain?
It could be, but I haven't seen any solid argument for that. And in fact, I think the cross-cultural evidence challenges that to some degree. I can give a couple examples that are, I think, pretty compelling. Is kind of the most recent dying brain theory that's come up in the media has been, scientists have discovered that there's a burst of electromagnetic energy in the brain at the moment of death. And they've identified this both in humans and in rats over time. So there have been quite a few articles in the last couple of years of, scientists identify the mechanism of an NDE. And specifically, they say that burst of energy is responsible for the life review. And what I mean by that is like the most kind of familiar stereotype of a life review in near-death experiences is that we have all of our memories occurring at once. Like your whole consciousness is flooded with everything that you've ever experienced. And that includes a lot of NDEers will say like an empathetic response to that. So if you hurt somebody, you're going to experience their pain. If, we're kind to somebody, you're going to experience that kindness back at you. But it's all kind of happening at once in this flood. Cross-culturally, that model of a panoramic life review just does not exist. I've hardly found any evidence for it at all. I think I mentioned earlier, if not, I should have, that one of the most common recurring features of NDEs is some kind of evaluation of your earthly life. So just thinking of a Native American example, there's a Native American who has an NDE, and he enters this dark room, and sitting behind a desk is a man with a beard, and he's like the kind of authority figure. And on a photograph behind this man on the wall is a photo of the man who's having the NDE. And somehow this photograph embodies all of his actions on Earth. So conceptually, that's like a panoramic life review, but he's not experiencing it in the same way that we hear about with contemporary NDEers. It's just kind of that picture embodies it, and he has that knowledge. So if that burst of electromagnetic energy at the moment of death is responsible for a life review, why aren't 19th century Native Americans having a panoramic life review? And why aren't anybody else having a panoramic life review? So that doesn't necessarily mean that panoramic life review is evidence for an afterlife. And in fact, it kind of begs the question, why are 20th and 21st century Westerners having panoramic life reviews? That's kind of another question, but it's a challenge to that dying brain hypothesis. I'll give another one, which I think is really interesting. So in contemporary NDEs, the Western stereotype is you're sent back to your body because, the being of light or a deceased relative say, it's not your time to die. You need to go back and care for your children. You need to go care for your spouse. Sometimes it's like you have to fulfill your work. You're in the middle of becoming a doctor and you need to finish your degree and help people, finish your PhD, whatever it is. But it's always a kind of personal thing. Whereas in a lot of other cultures, in India, China, Japan, there are a lot of cases of mistaken identity. And essentially, it's a clerical error in the other world. So the person, I'll die and I'll go to the other world and I'll meet this being of light. And he'll say, oh, hang on, according to our records, we got the wrong Gregory Shushan. We actually meant to get the one who lives in upstate New York or whatever. So I'll be sent back to my body and I'll wake up and I'll tell everyone about my NDE and how there was this, I was sent back to my body. And then the person who happens to have my own name will die permanently. And that mistaken identity reason for returning from an NDE is, as far as I know, totally unknown in modern Western examples. So if it's a dying brain, how do we explain that? And how do we explain it to begin with?
Yeah. Yeah, so many questions. That's so interesting. A clerical error. Even in death, we don't escape the DMV. That's a
Exactly.
real
Yeah.
shame.
Yeah. And some afterlife beliefs and some NDEs reflect that kind of earthy bureaucracy a lot more than others. In China, like it's a very, very bureaucratic afterlife. And then in some like reincarnation descriptions in the West, you might be familiar with the books by Michael Newton. He did like these kind of past life regression memories of the state between lives. A lot of them describe like a kind of very systematized afterlife, which to me sounds like a cruise ship. Like there's all these activities that you're supposed to do in groups and, a horror for introverts. Because,
Terrible.
It's time to go play shuffleboard on the deck,
Count me out.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that there is, there's obviously a lot of evidence to support that consciousness supports death. Do you think there is evidence that reincarnation is a thing? If we can post-exist, we could maybe also pre-exist?
Yeah, there is some interesting evidence. I find it compelling, but I don't get to the stage where I actually accept it and believe it. I just kind of think, this is an interesting phenomenon. And you're probably familiar with the work of Ian Stevenson at University of Virginia.
And Jim Tucker, yeah.
And Jim Tucker,
absolutely.
Yeah, a few others. Hato Masayuki has done a book on Japanese reincarnation cases, which is really interesting, following the same kind of methodology. But from my perspective, I looked at those in one of my books called The Next World. I looked at them specifically in relation to near-death experience descriptions. So instead of kind of evaluating the memories of the past personality that these children have, so the focus of people like Stevenson and Jim Tucker and Masayuki has been like, these kids talk about their memories of this particular individual. They remember their home and their relatives and the work that they did, even like details about how to get to their previous home and their job. So the evidential approach to prove that these accounts are real memories were to kind of track down and verify the memories that these children have. But from my perspective, what was more interesting was some of these children also remembered the death of their previous personality and where their soul went before they were reborn into their new personality. And their descriptions of that process, if you were to take out the knowledge that it's a reincarnation memory, they sound exactly like a near-death experience. Mm-hmm. So they will say, I was hit by a bus and my soul left my body and I looked down and I could see my body lying there. And I went to another world and I met a being of light and I met my deceased relatives. But then at that point, instead of being sent back to the body and waking up and saying I had a near-death experience, they are then sent into a new body. Sometimes they're allowed to choose that, like kind of together with the being of light or whatever. But it's this intermediate state, this realm, a transitional realm, which seems to be the same type of experience and state that near-death experiencers describe.
Doesn't it just kind of make you excited? Like, this is a personal question, obviously, but when I first read Dr. Bruce Grayson's book, and I've followed Dr. Jim Tucker's work, like it just, I don't know, it makes me feel some kind of way about how it all works. Like it's exciting. You still have the specialness of this one life, and yet you have the, hope of whatever's next after that. And I don't know, does it make you feel anything?
Yeah, those kinds of things that seem evidential, like when they really do find the personality associated with a kid's life, or just the fact of that similarity between those intermission memories. And by the way, I should have said, like, those intermission memories, those between life memories, they're children, very young children in Burma and India and Thailand and the Middle East and the West, all over the world. These kids haven't heard of Raymond Moody and Bruce Grayson and near-death experiences or my work. So these are spontaneous experiences or memories of the memories of something. So yeah, when I think about that, and then the other one that kind of gets me is near-death experiences when people encounter individuals who they didn't know had died, mm-hmm. and then they wake up and that's confirmed. So, and it's often, especially with children, where they'll say, I saw Uncle Bill in the other world, and they'll come back and say, well, actually, Uncle Bill died while you were in a coma.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's the only explanation is like collusion between children and parents and just inventing a story.
Yeah, it's wild for sure. This has been an incredibly fun discussion. I would love if you would wrap it up by telling people where they can buy your book and kind of just stay in touch with what's next for you, because you're always working on something, it seems.
Yeah, the book should be available pretty much everywhere, bricks and mortar stores, but also on all of the online outlets, Amazon or wherever you shop. And I also have a Patreon page if you want to find me there, and a website, gregoryshushan.com. I'm on most of the social media just under my full name too. So I'm pretty easy to find.
Perfect. Well,
at least virtually.
Thank you. Yeah, at least virtually. Thank you so much again. I really, really enjoyed this discussion.
Oh, thank you. Me too.
Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, you'll also like the one I did with the atheist doctor who studied near-death experiences for 50 years. That's episode 224. Or if you ever watch podcasts on YouTube, you can find me there too, and there's a whole playlist called Psi, PSI. Lots of good stuff in there. Stay tuned next week for a remastered favorite with an ADHD coach who shares insights and tips that you'll want to use right away. Until then, keep it curious.